Well, I haven't seen the vice president's statement, but he's generally very accurate. I hate to say, look, I watched that yesterday, and there were a lot of different forms to it. But there was a woman screaming, "Shame, shame, shame, shame." She was a agitator, probably a paid agitator.
In early February 2026, a quiet procedural shift inside the Department of Homeland Security exposed a much larger problem for the Trump administration. After a fatal enforcement incident in Minneapolis triggered protests and legal scrutiny, DHS announced that every federal immigration officer operating in the city would now wear a body-worn camera. Publicly, the move was framed as transparency. Privately, it reflected mounting pressure from courts, investigators, and local officials. President Trump endorsed the change, but stopped short of ordering it himself. What followed was not a reset of control, but a narrowing of options, as enforcement authority began to move out of political hands and into legal ones. The Trump administration entered 2026 determined to intensify immigration enforcement, particularly in Democratic-led cities. According to public reporting, federal agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement were deployed in Minneapolis as part of broader operations designed to demonstrate resolve and deterrence. The posture was aggressive, visible, and politically charged. That posture collided with reality when 2 U.S. citizens were killed during separate federal enforcement encounters in Minnesota. According to public reporting and court records, video footage from one incident quickly became central to public concern, appearing to contradict early official descriptions. As protests grew, local authorities moved to ensure that evidence connected to the shootings would be preserved. A federal judge issued a temporary restraining order preventing the destruction of investigative materials, signaling immediate judicial involvement. Although the restraining order was later lifted, the damage was already done. The court's intervention made clear that federal immigration enforcement was not insulated from judicial oversight, particularly when lethal force was involved. According to public reporting, civil rights investigations were opened, and state-level officials publicly questioned federal tactics. The legal process began shaping the enforcement environment faster than political messaging could. This was the administration's first major miscalculation. Trump's enforcement strategy assumed speed and authority would project control. Instead, the visibility of the operations triggered legal mechanisms designed to slow, document, and scrutinize federal action. Courts did not challenge immigration law itself. They constrained how it was carried out. That distinction mattered. It reduced operational discretion without requiring legislative change. As judicial scrutiny increased, enforcement became less about execution and more about compliance. Procedures, documentation, and evidence preservation moved to the center of decision-making. The administration had not planned for this shift. Forward pressure. Enforcement was no longer advancing on Trump's timetable, but on the courts. In the wake of the Minneapolis shootings, DHS leadership announced a rapid deployment of body-worn cameras to every federal immigration officer operating in the city. Secretary Kristi Noem framed the decision as a step toward transparency and accountability, saying the program would expand nationwide once funding allowed. President Trump publicly welcomed the use of body cameras, but stressed that the operational decision belonged to DHS leadership, not the White House. That distinction was revealing. This shift was not the product of a long-term enforcement strategy or a pre-planned reform. It was a reactive adaptation to mounting legal, political, and public pressure. For years, the federal government had resisted universal body camera requirements for immigration enforcement. Prior to 2026, only a small fraction of ICE officers had been issued cameras, roughly 4,400 out of an estimated 22,000 personnel, according to public reporting. Customs and Border Protection similarly lacked comprehensive camera coverage despite the size and scope of its operations. Minneapolis did not introduce a new philosophy. It exposed an old vulnerability. The timing mattered. The announcement came only after 2 unarmed civilians were killed during federal enforcement encounters and public trust deteriorated rapidly. Video footage circulating from at least one incident intensified scrutiny and made the absence of official recordings impossible to ignore. The camera rollout acknowledged a long-standing gap in accountability, but only after the political and legal costs of that gap became unavoidable. Legal actors played a decisive role in accelerating this procedural change. A federal restraining order requiring preservation of evidence related to one of the shootings demonstrated how courts could impose accountability without directly restricting enforcement authority. Even after the order was lifted, judicial involvement sent a clear signal that federal immigration actions were not insulated from oversight. Civil rights investigations initiated by the Department of Justice into at least one of the shootings added another layer of constraint, placing federal agencies under the shadow of potential litigation and formal review. Political pressure compounded the legal risk. In response to the Minneapolis incidents, some members of Congress pushed to include additional funding for body cameras in a DHS budget package introduced in late January. However, the House of Representatives did not pass the measure, resulting in a partial lapse of DHS funding for certain operations, even as essential enforcement continued. These budget dynamics limited the administration's ability to scale body camera deployment nationally and placed enforcement operations in an unstable financial environment. Civil society pressure further narrowed the administration's room to maneuver. Advocacy organizations, community leaders, and local officials in Minneapolis criticized the federal response as opaque and dangerous. Protests spread beyond Minnesota, amplifying demands for accountability and calling for body cameras across all federal enforcement operations. The combination of legal scrutiny, legislative uncertainty, and public mobilization increased the political cost of inaction. Analytically, the body camera announcement did not represent an anticipatory policy designed to strengthen operational control. It was a forced concession, a procedural adjustment aimed at containing fallout rather than shaping future enforcement. Trump's endorsement, framed as general support rather than directive authority, underscored his reactive posture. He accepted the measure, but he did not define it. In that light, the body camera rollout functioned less as leadership and more as damage control. Forward pressure. Once reactive concessions become procedural norms, they are difficult to reverse and increasingly limit executive discretion. By early February 2026, the Minneapolis body camera decision had stopped being a local adjustment and started functioning as a signal. It marked the moment when federal immigration enforcement, long treated as an arena of executive dominance, began operating inside a procedural cage built by courts, investigators, legislators, and public oversight. The administration did not lose authority in one dramatic ruling. It lost it incrementally through conditions. The first constraint was judicial. The temporary restraining order issued in Minnesota to preserve evidence related to a fatal enforcement encounter did not outlaw immigration operations. It did something more subtle and more durable. It attached legal expectations to procedure. Evidence could not be handled casually. Documentation mattered. Compliance would be examined. Even after the order was lifted, the message was clear. Enforcement actions would be evaluated not only on statutory authority, but on how they were executed. According to public reporting and court filings, that intervention reshaped the operating environment immediately. This was a blind spot in Trump's enforcement strategy. The administration had prepared for political opposition, protests, and media criticism. It had not prepared for rapid procedural entanglement. Courts do not argue ideology. They impose conditions. Once those conditions exist, they are difficult to reverse without prolonged litigation, and litigation itself further slows enforcement. Body cameras became the visible manifestation of that constraint. What had previously been optional or partial now took on the character of a compliance requirement. Not because Congress mandated it in statute, and not because the president ordered it as doctrine, but because operating without recorded evidence became legally and politically indefensible. According to public reporting, DHS leadership recognized that absence of footage would invite further court involvement, civil rights probes, and evidentiary disputes. Cameras were no longer a tool of transparency. They were a shield against exposure. This shift carried a cost that the administration had not fully accounted for. Body cameras generate data. Data generates obligations. Footage must be stored, cataloged, reviewed, preserved, and produced. Each of those steps creates administrative friction. Each becomes a potential point of legal challenge. According to public reporting, DHS did not have guaranteed funding to expand these systems nationwide, meaning any rollout beyond Minneapolis would depend on congressional appropriations and legislative goodwill. That dependency itself represented a transfer of leverage. Legislative dynamics intensified the constraint. Members of Congress, Responding to the Minneapolis incidents tied accountability demands to funding discussions. Some lawmakers pushed for broader reforms, including identification requirements and limits on federal enforcement anonymity. Others focused narrowly on body cameras as a baseline accountability measure. The result was not clarity, but conditionality. Funding became contingent on compliance, compliance became contingent on procedure, and procedure became contingent on legal interpretation. For the administration, this created an unstable equilibrium. Enforcement could continue, but only within narrowing boundaries. Announcements could be made, but implementation depended on institutions outside the White House. Trump's public posture reflected this reality. He endorsed body cameras, but emphasized that the decision belonged to DHS. That rhetorical distancing was not incidental. It acknowledged implicitly that the locus of control had shifted. Civil rights investigations added another layer. According to public reporting, federal civil rights authorities opened inquiries into at least one of the fatal encounters. These investigations operate on timelines independent of political cycles. They examine patterns, training, and compliance. Their findings can lead to recommendations, reforms, or further legal action. Even when they do not result in charges, they impose scrutiny that alters behavior. Enforcement agencies under investigation do not operate as freely as those without oversight. Public accountability mechanisms compounded the effect. Legal observer programs and advocacy groups announced plans to monitor federal enforcement activity more closely. These groups do not possess formal authority, but they generate documentation, amplify scrutiny, and feed information into legal and political channels. According to public reporting, their presence was intended to ensure that federal actions would be witnessed, recorded, and contested if necessary. That presence reinforced the expectation that enforcement would be conducted under constant observation. The cumulative effect was structural. None of these actors, courts, legislators, investigators, observers, needed to coordinate. Their pressures aligned organically. Each imposed a separate constraint, but together they reshaped the enforcement landscape. Executive authority did not vanish. It was fragmented. Decisions that once flowed through a single chain of command now pass through multiple filters. This fragmentation exposed the central miscalculation of Trump's approach. His enforcement strategy relied on speed, visibility, and deterrence. But speed invites error, visibility invites scrutiny, and deterrence invites resistance when it results in harm. The administration had assumed that authority could absorb those risks. Instead, authority triggered mechanisms designed to contain it. Once procedural oversight becomes normalized, it is difficult to roll back. Body cameras, once deployed, establish expectations. Courts, once engaged, do not disengage quickly. Investigations, once opened, do not conform to political calendars. According to public reporting, DHS leadership acknowledged that Minneapolis could become a model for future deployments, even if funding and policy specifics remained uncertain. That acknowledgement mattered. It suggested that what began as a concession was becoming a template. At this stage, Trump's options narrowed sharply. He could attempt to challenge judicial and investigative oversight, risking prolonged legal conflict and further public backlash. He could push Congress to fund and formalize procedural compliance, effectively institutionalizing the constraints. Or he could reduce the visibility and intensity of enforcement, undermining the very posture his strategy was built upon. None of these options restored unilateral control. The critical point is not that enforcement stopped. It is that enforcement changed character. It moved from an arena of executive assertion to an arena of procedural negotiation. Each action now carried downstream consequences: footage review, evidence preservation, potential litigation, budget scrutiny. The cost of action rose. The margin for error shrank. Trump's endorsement of body cameras, delivered without command language, underscored this reality. Approval without authorship is a sign of constrained leadership. It reflects adaptation, not dominance. The administration was adjusting to an environment it no longer shaped. Minneapolis revealed something larger than a policy tweak. It revealed how power erodes not through confrontation, but through conditioning. Enforcement authority remained intact in theory, but in practice, it was bounded by rules, expectations, and oversight imposed from outside the executive branch. Forward pressure. Once enforcement operates inside procedural walls, every subsequent decision becomes harder, slower, and less controllable than the last. As procedural norms solidified around body cameras and oversight, political strategy emerged as an unstable foundation for enforcement authority. Trump and his allies attempted to reframe the policy narrative, portraying body cameras as a tool for transparency and accuracy, while reiterating the administration's commitment to robust immigration enforcement. Yet political rhetoric alone could not override institutional realities. Political framing meets structural realities. In public statements, Trump emphasized that body cameras were broadly beneficial to law enforcement, but he consistently framed the decision as contingent on DHS leadership, not as a presidential directive. This distinction weakened the political command signal and ceded initiative to institutional actors. Back in Washington, debate over DHS funding included competing demands from Democrats for reform and from Republicans for strict enforcement without procedural constraints. The result was legislative stasis and continued partial funding uncertainty. Political arguments about transparency, about camera benefits mattered less to institutional actors than did procedural requirements embedded through legal and budgetary mechanisms. Courts and civil rights investigations were focused on compliance with standards of evidence and conduct. Legislators were demanding accountability measures tied to funding. Civil society groups amplified oversight through monitoring and documentation. These forces operated according to rules that political messaging could not easily alter. Operational consequences of procedural embedding. From an operational standpoint, embedding body cameras as a procedural expectation changes enforcement dynamics. Officers aware that their actions will be recorded, continuously reviewed, and possibly used in litigation face a different calculus than officers acting in an environment without such oversight. Procedural oversight does not eliminate enforcement, but it increases the friction documentation, review, accountability. These elements inevitably slow operations and require resources that were previously allocated elsewhere. More importantly, procedural oversight shifts risk to individual agents and agency leadership alike. Recorded actions can be subpoenaed, reviewed in civil rights investigations, and presented in political debates, exposing federal enforcement to multiple accountability vectors. In the past, enforcement actions might have proceeded with relatively low procedural transparency. Under the new landscape, transparency is baked into practice not by executive choice, but by external demand. Trump's legal blind spots and institutional limits. Trump's earlier posture presumed a level of executive autonomy that institutional actors were no longer willing to cede. The legal blind spot was an underestimation of how quickly courts and civil authorities would demand evidence preservation and oversight after public video contradicted initial federal accounts. The assumption that federal agencies could operate without robust, transparent mechanisms was disproven by armed conflict with judicial expectations. That miscalculation constrained the administration's leverage. The fiscal blind spot was equally consequential. Relying on future appropriations that were not guaranteed under a divided Congress meant that procedural changes like body camera rollouts were tethered to uncertain funding, not just policy will. This disconnect between political ambition and legislative reality further limited administrative control. In effect, political control was reshaped by law. Instead of politics dictating enforcement methods, legal conditioning and budgetary conflict were dictating political space. Forward pressure. Political narrative could no longer override structural constraint. By early February 2026, the fallout from Minneapolis was no longer a local story. It was a national inflection point in how immigration enforcement is constrained by institutions beyond the executive branch. Federal enforcement operations now operate within a web of legal expectations, public accountability norms, budgetary constraints, and political debate. Body cameras are a visible symbol of that shift. What once was a discretionary tool issued to fewer than a quarter of ICE agents is now an expected condition of deployment in at least Minneapolis, with promises, but no certain funding, for nationwide expansion. This procedural expectation reduces ambiguity about enforcement conduct, but it also embeds external oversight into day-to-day operations. Courts can request preservation orders. Civil rights investigations can probe, conduct captured on video. Legislators can condition funding on compliance measures. The consequence is that enforcement strategy is no longer solely determined in the White House or DHS leadership offices. The legal and political environment now co-authors procedural boundaries. Trump faces a narrowing set of choices. Capitulate to procedural norms, fully embrace body cameras and related oversight as permanent features of immigration enforcement, effectively institutionalizing the legal constraints. Legally challenge oversight mechanisms, attempt to roll back judicial conditioning or legislative leverage, but risk further political conflict and more entrenched resistance. Scale back enforcement intensity, an implicit acknowledgement that unconstrained enforcement is no longer feasible. None of these restore unilateral control. Instead, they underscore that Trump's remaining options must reckon with institutional constraints that have become structural, not temporary. What Minneapolis revealed is that aggressive immigration enforcement, when it results in dead civilians and widespread public visibility, triggers legal and political muscles that can reshape policy from the outside in. The body camera rollout is not merely a piece of equipment. It's a marker of where authority now resides, shared among courts, legislators, public accountability mechanisms, and executive leadership. The administration's reactive posture, accepting procedural constraints only after they became politically and legally unavoidable, highlights a broader theme. Reactive concession, when embedded structurally, can outlast the events that triggered it. Trump's enforcement agenda, once defined by unilateral ambition, is now bounded by external forces that will continue to shape what is possible.